What if isolating Russia is costing the West far more than it costs Russia itself? For years, Western leaders have framed this standoff as a clash of values, freedom and justice against aggression and autocracy. But beneath these stirring slogans lies a labyrinth of realpolitik, secret deals, shifting allegiances, and power brokers who see morality less as a compass and more as a bargaining chip. To fully understand the stakes, imagine sitting in the gilded halls of European parliaments in the early 2000s. Politicians speak with conviction about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Yet, in the shadows, contracts are signed for pipelines, rare minerals, and lucrative military technology, a dance between principle and profit that has persisted since the dawn of modern diplomacy. To some, the campaign against Russia is a battle for the soul of the modern world, a 21st-century replay of earlier crusades for moral order. Yet for others, it is just another high-stakes market, where every sanction, every alliance, and every handshake comes with a price. The Cold War itself, for instance, was as much about economic spheres of influence as it was about ideology. Western support for certain regimes, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, was often justified in moral terms, but motivated by the desire to secure resources and contain adversaries. No one embodies this view more clearly than Donald Trump. In his eyes, Russia is neither mortal foe nor loyal ally. It is a valuable, unclaimed asset waiting to be leveraged, a piece on the global chessboard ready for a deal. Think of the property developer surveying a city skyline, seeing not historic landmarks, but opportunities for new skyscrapers. That is Trump's approach to geopolitics. What can be acquired, flipped, or bargained for? This is not simply the West squaring off with the Kremlin. It is a contest for the shape of the future world order itself. Trump's playbook is blunt. Put America first, and let strategy, not sentiment, dictate the moves. With Russia, he sees openings, room for negotiation, profit, and advantage, not a moral crusade. For him, the world is up for grabs, and every nation is a potential deal if the terms suit American interests. Consider the difference between the Marshall Plan after World War II, where American aid was tied to opening markets and political alignment, and Trump's threats to withdraw from NATO unless European allies increase their defense spending. In both cases, the underlying logic is transactional, but Trump strips away the rhetoric. But here lies the real danger. Mistaking postures for principles and values for leverage risks making nations poorer, less secure, and exposed in ways they barely see. As Europe tightens its own economic noose to punish Moscow, China profits quietly in the shadows, and the old rules of alliance and enmity dissolve before our eyes. Energy flows, security agreements, and the livelihoods of millions now hang in the balance, far beyond the headlines and talking points. Let us strip away the slogans and follow the shadow deals that truly shape our world. Every transaction, every sanction, every whispered promise leaves its mark. To understand the real stakes, we have to trace the deals happening behind closed doors. For centuries, Western prosperity was built on the compliance of others. But what happens when that order is challenged, when the rules that favored the West are no longer obeyed? Think back to the British Empire's dominance over India, or Belgium's grip on the Congo. These were not partnerships of equals, but systems built on extraction and managed subservience. The pattern repeated in the Cold War, when Western Europe's prosperity depended on cheap energy, at times from the Soviet Union itself, and cheap labor from the developing world. The Western world's power did not arise from fair play. For hundreds of years, empires grew rich by extracting resources, enforcing dominance, and demanding obedience from distant lands. The wealth of Europe and America flowed from colonies, plantations, and the forced silence of entire regions, all cloaked in lofty ideals and promises of progress. Russia, for much of modern history, was expected to play a limited role, supplier, not equal. Its resources fueled Western industries, its pipelines were opened or closed at the West's command, and its leaders were meant to accept their place. Moscow's wealth was never meant to disrupt the global order only to serve it. But the world turned. Where Russia once spoke softly, it now acts with determination, first at the negotiating table, then on the global stage, and finally, through bold defiance. Let us consider the gas crises of the early 2000s, when Russia briefly halted supplies to Ukraine and, by extension, to parts of Europe. The West viewed these moves as blackmail. But from Moscow's perspective, it was simply demanding fair payment and respect, a bid for equality in a system that long took Russian resources for granted. No longer content to simply obey, Russia began to set its own terms. It chose its buyers, negotiated its prices, and sought out partners outside the traditional system. For Western strategists used to treating the globe as a corporate boardroom, this was a fundamental challenge, a breach of the unwritten contract that had kept the world predictable. Russia's independence was not seen as a policy shift, but as a direct threat, a dangerous invitation for others to follow suit. If Russia could walk away from the deal, what stopped others from doing the same? Moscow's defiance became a crack in the foundation, a signal that the old rules could be broken. The response was swift. Sanctions, proxy wars, and media campaigns, all designed to punish Russian autonomy and deter imitators. The goal was not only to isolate Russia, but to contain the risk of rebellion spreading. We have seen this pattern before. When OPEC flexed its muscles in the 1970s, raising oil prices and defying Western expectations, the response was similar: efforts to destabilize, marginalize, and regain control. Today, the West's anxiety over Russia is driven by the same fear, that one actor's rebellion could cascade into systemic change. Europe, caught in the middle, made its own sacrifices. Cheap energy vanished, industries faltered, and debt mounted, all for the hope that Russian collapse would restore Western control. Yet, as Moscow stood firm, the costs mounted. The pillars of Western dominance began to shake. The global order was no longer unchallenged. New alliances formed, and power started to shift eastward. For instance, Germany's once mighty chemical industry, the envy of the world, is now struggling with high input costs and shrinking margins. In France, fertilizer factories shuttered, leading to higher food prices. Across Eastern Europe, entire communities built around steel or aluminum works have been plunged into uncertainty. The stakes could not be higher. Not only the fate of Russia, but the future of the world's economic and security architecture. If other nations follow Moscow's example, the system that enriched the West could unravel, putting at risk trillions in revenue, destabilizing continents, and threatening the livelihoods of millions who depend on energy and trade. Let us not forget the collapse of the Soviet Union, which sent shockwaves through global markets and forced dramatic shifts in alliances. Today, the risk is not collapse, but transformation, a world where the old powers must compete on new, less favorable terms. Into this storm steps Donald Trump, ready to rewrite the playbook and redefine the West's relationship with Russia. Trump brings a transactional mindset to geopolitics, viewing Russia not as a rival or ally, but as a lever for American interests. His approach threatens to upend decades of entrenched policy and change the global balance of power. Donald Trump is not interested in values. He is focused on who holds the keys to the cash register. For Trump, foreign policy is not a crusade for democracy or a defense of Western ideals. It is a high-stakes marketplace where leverage and profit matter more than principles. His style is ruthless, direct, and unapologetically transactional. Consider his approach to North Korea. After exchanging insults with Kim Jong-un, Trump pivoted to unprecedented talks, seeking a deal rather than a standoff. The same logic applied to his dealings with the European Union, where he threatened tariffs on European cars not to punish, but to extract concessions in trade negotiations. He puts pressure on every major player, China, Europe, even Russia, to force better deals for America. Trade wars, in his mind, are not about punishing adversaries, but about shifting profits and power back to Washington. Sanctions are not moral judgments. They are bargaining chips, thrown onto the table to force the other side's hand. When Trump slaps tariffs on Europe, it is not about healing old alliances. It is a blunt message: pay up or lose access. When he targets China with trade restrictions, the motivation is not human rights, but securing America's share of the global market. Every move is calculated, every threat a tactic in negotiation, not a crusade for ideals. In this worldview, Russia is not an enemy, nor a true ally. Russia is a valuable asset, a player too powerful and resource-rich to ignore or simply punish. Trump sees Moscow as a piece on the grand chessboard, one that could help America reshape the entire game if used wisely. But Russia is done playing the silent partner. The Kremlin now offers partnerships, not submission. They propose trade, energy, and technology deals on equal footing, demanding respect and sovereignty in return. This marks a sharp break from the past, when Moscow often played second fiddle to Western interests. This new Russian posture clashes with the mentality of the old globalists, who still expect compliance from countries outside the Western core. Trump, in his way, senses the global shift, but his instinct is to compete, not cooperate. Instead of embracing Russia's offer of partnership, he tries to turn it into a contest, hoping to pull Moscow away from Beijing and crown America as the ultimate broker. But this strategy is playing with fire. America could end up isolated in a world moving toward flexible partnerships and shifting alliances, not rigid dominance. Europe is stuck in the middle, squeezed by expensive energy and Washington's tough tactics. Meanwhile, China watches, anxious about losing a crucial partner. Trump's logic is simple: keep rivals off balance, maintain pressure, and always negotiate from a position of strength. Yet as the world moves toward multipolar alliances and deal-making among equals, America's old playbook is showing its age and its risks. The stakes are enormous: trillions in energy revenues, the geopolitical fate of continents, and the economic survival of millions hang in the balance. In this new era, every decision reverberates across the globe. Europe tried to punish Russia with sweeping sanctions, but in trying to wound Moscow, did it just hand its future to Beijing? When Europe cut itself off from Russian energy, leaders expected the Kremlin to cave. But the energy flows did not stop. They simply pivoted east. The pipelines that once fueled German factories began feeding China's bottomless hunger for oil and gas. China wasted no time. As European industries staggered under surging energy bills and rolling blackouts, Beijing locked in long-term contracts for cheap Russian resources. What was designed to isolate Moscow instead supercharged China's ascent as an energy and industrial titan. For Europe, the fallout has been harsh. Exploding costs forced entire sectors, chemicals, aluminum, fertilizers, to shrink or shutter. The continent once celebrated for its industrial prowess now faces deindustrialization, mass layoffs, and a mounting political crisis that deepens month by month. Meanwhile, Russia proved far more nimble than many Western analysts expected. Rather than wither, its energy empire found eager new clients across Asia, from India to China. Revenues kept streaming into Moscow, funding both its economy and its global ambitions. Europe, by contrast, is left grappling with wounds largely of its own making. The grand plan to weaken Moscow has instead undermined itself. National security is now on the line, as reliance shifts from one rival to another. For millions of workers and families, the price is painfully tangible: jobs vanished, bills unpaid, futures hanging by a thread. Yet the quiet victor in this upheaval is China. Patient, pragmatic, and often silent, Beijing has seized Europe's crisis to fortify its energy security, widen its influence, and subtly challenge Western dominance. The global chessboard has shifted, and not in the way strategists in Brussels or Washington imagined. The risks are staggering. Entire industries, critical supply chains, and Europe's very place in the world are now in jeopardy. So what can we learn from these ruthless maneuvers on the global stage? The answer may lie in the moves yet to be played. In this high-stakes contest, the next phase will reveal whether Europe adapts or if its rivals claim the ultimate prize. The endgame is far from decided. What if the gravest danger is not Russia itself, but our own refusal to see clearly? Again and again, noble-sounding crusades mask the harm nations inflict upon themselves. When leaders invoke grand ideals, they often turn a blind eye to the price paid at home: rising costs, disappearing jobs, and fragile security slipping away. Rallying around slogans may feel righteous, but flexible, strategic thinking always outlasts rigid dogma. In this volatile era, states that cling to old myths risk the most. They undermine their own economies, isolate their people, and surrender leverage to those who adapt faster and play harder. Real power is not found in fiery speeches or waving banners. It is measured in resources, infrastructure, and relentless negotiation. Oil, gas, pipelines, and steady contracts. These are the tools that shape destinies, not grand gestures or embargoes trumpeted on the evening news. Never forget, those who shout loudest for sanctions and crusades rarely pay the price themselves. The burden falls on ordinary citizens, businesses, and workers. Meanwhile, countries willing to question stale alliances and strike pragmatic bargains often weather the storm, and sometimes emerge even stronger. When leaders and citizens cannot pierce the fog of geopolitical theater, they risk becoming casualties of their own illusions. Europe's break with Russian energy was not merely a moral stand. It was a high-stakes gamble that unleashed an energy crisis, triggered deindustrialization, and deepened debt. All this for the appearance of control, not genuine advantage. The cost of stubbornness is measured not only in bruised egos, but in survival itself. The world is shifting beneath our feet. Those who cling to fading certainties risk being left behind, or manipulated as pawns by sharper players. Now, as the dust settles, new alliances and rivalries are shaping the global order. The real contest has only just begun. When the slogans fade and the headlines blur, only the deals endure. So whose side are you truly on? In the end, all talk of values, alliances, and grand missions shrinks to a single question: who commands the flow of power, money, and influence? The global struggle over Russia was never about democracy versus autocracy, nor about high ideals. It has always boiled down to leverage, negotiation, and transactional gain. Grand speeches evaporate. What remains are the contracts, the handshakes, and the bills paid or due. For Donald Trump, Russia is neither a friend nor an adversary. It is a strategic asset, a lever to be pulled when the stakes are highest, a bargaining chip in a ruthless, unending game. Old dogmas and traditional alliances do not sway him. The only thing that matters is who sits at the table when the world's resources are split. Sanctions, in this view, are not statements of principle. They are opening bids, tools to strike a better bargain, not symbols of moral clarity. Let us look at another historical parallel. In the 1970s, President Nixon traveled to China, opening diplomatic relations not because of shared values, but to counterbalance Soviet power. It was a cold calculation, much like Trump's instincts toward Russia. Both saw alliances as flexible, to be shaped according to the needs of the moment. As the West tried to isolate Moscow with sanctions and ultimatums, the world's energy flows found new routes. These measures did not break Russia. Instead, they reshaped the map. New pipelines snaked toward China, cracks splintered Europe's economy, and the old order wobbled. Trillions of dollars in energy shifted direction. Entire sectors were thrown into uncertainty, and millions across continents felt the shock every time they paid for heat, fuel, or food. The risks are unmistakable now. When you let myths or nostalgia shape your choices, you gamble with your own security and prosperity. Those who cling to the fairy tale of eternal alliances or permanent enemies are setting themselves up for disappointment and loss. In this new world, the winners are not the loudest voices, but those who look past the slogans and demand that leaders explain the deals made in their name. So ask yourself, are you trapped by yesterday's stories, or ready to demand realism, transparency, and accountability from those in power? Understanding these shifts is not just a matter for diplomats or generals. It is the key to protecting your security, your family's livelihood, and your nation's future in a world where only hard bargains and clear-eyed choices matter. Let us consider some practical steps for citizens and policymakers alike. First, demand transparency. Insist that leaders explain not only what deals are made on your behalf, but why. When governments sign new energy contracts or enter into trade partnerships, the reasoning and risks should be clear. This might mean strengthening oversight bodies, supporting investigative journalism, and making public procurement processes more open. Second, diversify alliances and supply chains. Relying on a single partner for vital resources, be it energy, technology, or food, leaves nations vulnerable to shocks and blackmail. The lesson of Europe's overdependence on Russian gas should serve as a warning. Countries should cultivate multiple sources, invest in domestic capacity where possible, and build redundancy into their economic systems. Third, invest in adaptability. The world is changing too rapidly for rigid doctrines. Whether through education, infrastructure upgrades, or research into renewables, nations that adapt fastest to new realities will emerge strongest. Consider the example of South Korea, which transformed itself from a war-torn state into an economic powerhouse by relentlessly investing in innovation and skills. Fourth, foster critical thinking among citizens. Propaganda and simplistic narratives thrive where information is scarce and debate is discouraged. Societies that encourage open discussion, analytical skills, and historical perspective are less likely to fall for the next round of empty slogans or scapegoating campaigns. Fifth, recognize the real costs of foreign policy. Every sanction, every embargo, every military deployment has consequences at home. Policymakers should be required to conduct and publish thorough cost-benefit analyses, weighing not just the intended effects, but also the potential for blowback and unintended harm. Sixth, remember the human element. Geopolitical shifts are not just abstractions, they affect real people. When industries close, workers lose more than paychecks, they lose dignity and hope. Governments must prioritize support for those harmed by global realignments, whether through retraining programs, social safety nets, or community investment. Finally, cultivate humility. The world is too complex for any one nation, ideology, or leader to control. The most successful actors will be those willing to learn, admit mistakes, and change course when necessary. In the words of former U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, if man does find the solution for world peace, it will be the most revolutionary reversal of his record we have ever known. In the coming years, the competition for power, resources, and influence will only intensify. The era of absolute dominance is over. The age of negotiation has begun. Those who cling to the past, to comforting fables or rigid hierarchies, will find themselves outmaneuvered by those who see the world as it is, messy, transactional, and relentlessly dynamic. So, as the headlines fade and the slogans lose their luster, remember, the true story is told in the deals made, the alliances shifted, and the lives changed by decisions in distant halls. The world's future will not be decided by the loudest voice or the boldest claim, but by those who master the art of the deal, the patience of negotiation, and the discipline to adapt. Ask yourself, when the next crisis comes, will your leaders be ready, or will they be trapped in the illusions of a world that no longer exists? In this new world, only those who see clearly, act pragmatically, and remember the human cost will thrive. The choice, as always, is ours.